Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Effects of Carbon Pricing in Mexico, From Subsidies to Taxes. We're grateful to Carlos Muñoz Piña for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues amongst professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speaker. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our speaker, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to Carlos Muñoz Piña. He is currently Director for Research and Data Integrity at the World Resources Institute. Carlos, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for inviting me to the seminar. And let me start with the general story. The general story is that Mexico had for many years very high fossil fuel subsidies. And as we've known, that is actually increasing consumption of fossil fuels and contributing to global warming beyond what the market by itself would be doing, but what market prices would be doing. And there is a great emphasis now at COP27 and in several of the meetings of the UNFCCC that the world needs to send a strong carbon signal. So why are countries like Mexico and Indonesia have been for so long generating subsidies, going the other way around, increasing consumption? And this is a story of what happened in Mexico and what was done over the course of a decade to convert them into positive carbon pricing. And this work was done with my colleagues, Mariza Montes and Marisol Rivera, and it was recently published in the Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy 2022. Well, and this is the bottom line. 2008, Mexico had 1.8% of its GDP as fossil fuel subsidies. And that strong signal to consume more and was going against any promise made by during the Conference of Parties and any commitments from the Kyoto Protocol or later the Paris Agreement. And then after the G20 meeting in Mexico as part of that, the OECD meetings, the commitment to reduce subsidies was an international commitment by Mexico. The rehearsal and the story, the entire half an hour we will be talking, it's going to be about how did we get to the 1.6 of GDP being carbon taxes, strong carbon signals in 2018, and what has happened since. And then you would ask why a country would put subsidies on fossil fuels. One of the main reasons is what the temptation that has been very recently in the past couple of years, when fuel prices rise very fast, there is a large public sentiment against them and governments tend to intervene. But in Mexico, it was since the 50s, the structural reason why subsidies got so great. The government had the mandate to define domestic fuel prices because the Pemex, the national oil company, was by regulation the only one able to sell gasoline and diesel. The one able to produce gasoline and diesel, the only one to import gasoline and diesel. And thus the old eyes were on the oil company saying, well, define the prices. But that interaction went between the oil producing between the state of company and the federal government, because it was a very important source of revenues. Actually, the difference between the administratively decided prices and the opportunity cost of exporting or importing the fuels was what made the revenues. It was a very important source of revenues, and that was those, the first variable was controlled, the other one was not. And the public finances were the ones who adjusted for any differential there. The high political sensitivity meant that in periods with high international gasoline or diesel prices, the prices in Mexico would be kept more or less at the same level, saying, no, nothing happens. We're isolating, the government is isolating the consumers from whatever external shocks there were, but that absorption meant subsidies if the prices had a spike or began to run really high. And that was the story in Mexico. For most of the time, and see this period between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s, the difference between the international price of gasoline, what you see there as the red line, and the domestic prices, you see much smoother because the price, the management of the prices was smoothing. One of the objectives was smoothing prices. The green area means positive taxation. And you can see mid-90s, mid-2000s, Mexico had a relatively good carbon taxation. And that was the story from previous years. So the government used to those revenues, then the spike began. The increase in prices, as you can see, the international reference prices for gasoline and for diesel and for all petroleum-related products begin to grow as international oil prices begin to rise. So we had this very jumpy period in the mid-2000s and the very stable domestic price. But now we moved from having a significant green area, significant taxes, to having a very small portion of those previous taxes being received over the quarters of 2004, and then they became subsidies. Into 2005, 6, 7, and 8, subsidies begin to grow really fast. And that's when we got to this more than 1% of GDP being given as subsidies in Mexico. Then, despite when the 2009 recession hit, then the fall in oil prices, in oil prices, and the fall in gasoline and diesel prices gave a very slight relief. And you can see how the domestic price was kept constant, because if the public was being isolated from positive shocks, from negative shocks of having high international prices, but also from the opposite, the mirror shocks, the one when they fell, because the Mexican gasoline and diesel market was not driven by the market, it was driven by the administrative decisions. So the problems, there was a slight relief, but then they began to grow again, as in general, the oil prices were returning to their traditional high levels. But then you can see the change in policy. This is when, both for internal fiscal reasons, because it was first to forego and such an important source of revenues, and then to begin to be able to give those subsidies at the time, it was unsustainable. The international calls, the domestic calls for a revision of the prices made the politically very hard decision to increase the prices. And you can see the blue line begins to move upward, and it begins to move very gradually. You can see it's almost a straight line, because the idea was to have a very, very gradual phase out of the fossil fuel subsidies. And if you see the story from the point of view of the 2010, well, it seems that the gap was being reduced. But no, in 2011, when the oil prices go back again, then subsidies grow faster than the domestic price. It is a race between the international price and the domestic price. And it has an important distributional consequence, because in countries like Mexico, high middle income countries, the owners of cars, the households that own cars, are basically the first decile, with some on the second decile of the income distribution, and very few of the middle income families. And not to say the poor, which households, which basically use public transportation. And you can see that any subsidy to gasoline, in this case, would become heavily biased towards the richer households, to the first decile and the second decile, to the first quintile of the distribution. And you can see here the 3.5 thousand million pesos, and mind you, the rate of the dollar to peso is at 20 to 1. We're talking about 1%, almost 2% of Mexico's GDP being given, half of that to the 20% richest part of the households. And that was the story in 2008. Remember, in 2010, the subsidy fell because the international oil prices fell and the domestic prices began to rise. So the subsidy gap was reduced, but the distribution was the same. It was unequal distribution of income through the fossil fuel subsidies. So it was not only harming the planet, but also increasing the inequality of income in a country that already has the second highest income inequality after Brazil. It was the opportunity cost of those revenues lost when subsidies begin to grow, and the significant transfer from the public finance towards the richer households. Now, what do we do? And here is the part of the political economy of the decision. As Iran began to do it, and as other countries had a discrete one-off price hike to get rid of the subsidies, the alternative was the gradual monthly phase-out, which Mexico chose. Any shock, any fast increase in prices even had its name in Mexico. It's gasolinazo, the idea of that the sharp increase in domestic prices. So definitely having a fast budget relief could only be obtained by having a shock. But the political backlash would be much stronger than the gradual monthly phase out of subsidies. And the need for direct compensation, both as Iran in the 2000s began to do, and all the oil-rich countries that had subsidies, Indonesia also, the idea of a direct compensation was in the political debate. If prices jump, then you have to give a direct compensation to the ones losing. And but in our case, remember, Mexico had most of the ones who were going to lose were the richest quintile of the income distribution. So this was the trade-off, the decision, and it went through the gradual phase out. So you can see the blue line moving actually faster. The increase in domestic prices was stepped up, and it was this race between the international prices. By the end of 2013, the subsidies had already fallen down. The gap had been closed just by keeping, no matter what happened to the international price, the domestic prices kept up increasing. It was driven mainly by fiscal reasons, by the idea of having a budget that did not spend money on the richer households, despite the political backlash for any increase by all income groups, because the effect goes through the entire input-output matrix. But the gap was being closed. So by the end of 2013, the phase-out was being completed on expected value, on average, but still very sensitive to shocks. Anything that happened to the international prices would drive us again into the subsidy territory. Now we come in with the innovation. Mexico innovated by establishing a carbon tax. Mind you, the fossil fuel subsidy phase out was almost completed by the end of 2013. So the idea of the carbon tax first was very strange. Why would you put a carbon tax, an explicit carbon tax, when you had so large subsidies on gasoline and diesel at least. And the main point was it was symbolic. The idea that carbon taxation was here to stay, that it was a very important signal to send, and that it was for environmental reasons, for fiscal reasons, it was part of the general strategy. And the idea was to consolidate the fossil fuel subsidy phase out by having a positive quota per liter. It didn't depend on prices. It was a per liter or per ton if it was a solid fossil fuel, or by cubic meter if it was gas. But the idea was all fossil fuels would be receive a modest around the initial proposal was around $5, but then it became $3.5 per ton of CO2. The idea of introducing carbon pricing was to consolidate the phase out and to introduce carbon pricing signals, both implicit and explicit. And you can see here the 2014 initiative, where the president's initiative was to tax at $5.4 per ton of CO2, and all fossil fuels would have that same price per ton of CO2, which meant different US cents per unit, per liter, per cubic meter, per kilogram, to the different fuels according to their carbon content. Negotiations in Congress gave us a final picture where the general tax was reduced, or the aim from 5.4 to 3.4, 3.5, most of the transfer fuels, the ones used by decentralized consumers. But industry with a stronger lobby managed to get those numbers down. In the case of coal and pet coke, it was less than $1. Fuel oil, because it generates so much local pollution, still kept it 3.5, but natural gas received a zero tax. Basically thinking, or the political rationale was, it is a cleaner fuel, it has less local pollution. So in a sense, the internalization of externality need not to be as high as fuel oil, for example. And it was the switching fuel, the idea of changing not only the absolute prices to reduce consumption through the price elasticity, but to look at cross-price elasticity and switch away from the more polluting fuels, the less efficient fuels per unit of energy and CO2, or the local criteria pollutants, to reduce that consumption, to promote the switch by changing the relative prices. So it is a cross-price elasticity story. And the change in the market price, it is small. It's around 1%, almost 2% in fuel oil. So you are not expecting, given price elasticities, a very large change. It is a modest. Remember, its role was symbolic. The idea of, we will not have subsidies, we will have taxes, positive carbon taxation. So this is the story. The carbon tax enters, and the idea was, well, how do we consolidate this situation? Remember that the origin of the problem was that the government had too much control. It was controlling both production, imports, prices. So the political pressure to do something about was very high. One of the two elements is a tax reform, where the fuel taxes become part of the solution, where the design of the taxes, instead of being the result of the difference of the domestically, administratively determined carbon fuel price and the opportunity cost of importing or exporting, gave us the fiscal result. In this case, no, we will, Mexico opened imports, saying Pemex will not be the monopoly anymore, and switching from having a administrative decided price to a maximum price in 2015, and then with the promise, with the schedule of having market conditions in 2018. So it is an energy reform, our price liberalization towards moving towards the end of the decade. And the outcome was, well, let's have an per unit tax, per liter tax. That way, it is separated from whatever the price is, the international reference price, it is always a per unit tax, and that gives it more resilient, both in legal terms and as part of the political decision. So, a tax reform and an energy reform in 2015 seeks to consolidate the carbon subsidy phase out and to move into positive taxation. And that is what happens. First, remember that from the administrative price, it became a maximum price and then moved into a market price for gasoline and fuel. Those of you from countries that have always had market prices will be astonished to know that there weren't. And those of you from countries that have administrative prices would say, how can you have a switch from government deciding to complete market decision in just a few years? But that was the depth of the reform. And see how the blue line of the domestic prices, in this case for regular gasoline, after the large increase, once domestic prices fall, the red line showing the international reference prices, that for Mexico is the Gulf Coast reference, they are kept stable while the international prices fall. So with political, with very parsimonious decisions, not move the domestic price, the maximum price, and then begin to allow the market prices to flow in, the depth of the tax revenues begin to grow. The area in green, it is very large in 2015, 2016, when the international prices are moving down. But then in 2017, once there's a positive shock in prices, prices begin to grow again, international prices, then there's this consolidation, a very large spike in domestic prices, saying if we're going to have liberalization in 2018, it better start from a high point than from a low point, because from a high point, anything that will happen would be lowering the prices, and the public will see domestic prices either stable or moving downward with the market, and so the market would gain more acceptance. The strategy worked. The positive taxation consolidated during those years, and you can see now the blue line moving closer to the international prices. The idea is that the market would have been gradually influencing the result. It is not perfect market prices by the time, because the per unit taxation receives a smoothing condition by adjusting the excise tax, but still follows very closely the market prices. Now, this is the summary of the changes in price structure, the tax structure, and the market structure. Those three things are very important, because Pemex becomes a profit maximizing, productivity-oriented firm by the end of the decade, and the imports and sales are open to other firms. So you have competition. And the idea of having competition is, well, you can administer the price if there's a state-owned company, but if there's competition, you cannot control the prices of all private actors, and Pemex should act as a private actor. And so you cannot mess with prices. You can alter taxes, and you can work on taxes, but not on the prices. And the price structure changes, well, the introduction of the carbon tax as a per unit, and the excise tax also becomes a quota tax with weekly adjustments. So it's a moving average. And that, by consolidating the statewide liberalization and then the national-wide liberalization, begins to create the circumstances for the resilient tax positive carbon pricing we see by the end of the decade. Now, if the story was that it was very unequal, the distribution of the subsidies in 2008, 2010, 2012 was amazing, just the inequality generated. By 2014, when the subsidy phase out is being consolidated, reaching the point of at least balance of, on average, eliminating the subsidy. Remember, the shocks are always there. But at this time, the distribution has been reduced so much that only the richest quintile is receiving just 1/20th of what it was receiving in the period of high subsidies. On average, in 2014, by the end of 2014, by the last quarter of 2014, those are zero. And what happens when taxation comes in? Here is the story. Now we have a complete reversal. From being a regressive subsidy, it becomes a progressive tax, taxing the richer households, the ones that own cars, that consume most of the gasoline, and they consume most of the goods that have the diesel embedded into that. So it becomes, and then it becomes highly progressive. It was highly regressive, and now it's a highly progressive taxation. Mexico generates by 2018 nearly $544 million, and almost 2/3 of that is coming from the richest quintile. That is a very important income distribution effect of positive carbon taxation. And remind you, it is between 1.5 and 2% of GDP, the tax revenues. It becomes one of the cornerstones of Mexican revenues, and because of that, of public expenditure. Now, what happened to the system? I told you that the idea was to build resilience through market rules for gasoline and diesel, for opening the monopoly and to competition, and to have a more modern or stable, basically an excise tax per unit, and with a carbon tax, with some smoothing, but mostly consolidating into a positive tax. And what we have now is, even during lockdown, when prices fell internationally, then at the time where public revenues were most needed to have the COVID response, Mexico had a very resilient gasoline tax structure. So most of the expenditure to jumpstart the economy and to attend the health crisis had carbon pricing taxes as one of its key elements. Now, when prices of international oil prices begin to rise again with the invasion of Ukraine, you can see how the very sharp increase in oil prices becomes the same thing for gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, related petrochemical products. And you would say that the tax structure begins to fall down. And indeed, because with the change in administration, the idea of having free moving gasoline prices was, the promise was made, the political promise, that gasoline prices would not increase above their real levels. Their levels, and then the Minister of Finance said, well, levels are the real price levels. So the taxes begin to fall. And at the peak, when the world had barrels of oil at more than $100 per barrel, then the tax disappears. But subsidies do not reappear, and that is part of the resilience, that the structure is there to reduce subsidies so much that first they would not use the mechanism of domestic prices, because that was taken away from the government, and it could only be smoothing, reducing the net taxation that happens. And as prices begin to fall, as we go below the $100 per barrel mark, towards the $90 per mark, taxes have reappeared and will be reappearing in the future. Well, what does this mean for the climate change policy? What does this mean for the decarbonization, the promises made by Mexico to reduce 22% of its emissions compared to baseline that we would have in 2030, the NDC promised by Mexico? And the idea is that carbon pricing should be part of the strategy. And you can see in these two graphs for regular gasoline and diesel, what is the implicit plus explicit carbon pricing. The first one, you can see how the 2000s have a negative price. And it's a very heavy negative price. We're talking about minus $40 per ton of CO2. It's a subsidy, not even a tax. It is a subsidy of $20, $30, $40. It's the complete opposite signal towards a super carbonization of the economy, of having too much. And that is something that Nigeria and Indonesia would be familiar with. You have more than expected consumption of gasoline and diesel per $1 million of GDP just because you're providing subsidies. You're giving the wrong signal. But see how the moment we switch to subsidies, we do not only have the positive redistribution towards the progressive redistributive effect of having taxes and then spending. This spending stories also, but spending tends to be progressive in Mexico with the poverty reduction transfers, the direct cash transfers. But even with that, we have a positive carbon price. And it's part of this distributive strategy, it's part of the energy strategy, the fiscal strategy, and the environmental strategy. Look here how in red, we see the carbon tax. And the carbon tax is so modest that you can only see like the icing in the cake. It is a very important signal. It is a very important part of the commitment, but it's relatively small. The real effect is being brought by excise taxes on gasoline, not the carbon tax, explicit carbon pricing, but the implicit carbon pricing through the excise tax. And here what we have is that first we jump to 40, 50. Remember, whenever there are shocks, the smoothing mechanism falls, makes the carbon price fall, but then it recovers again when the oil prices begin to fall, when they are, and the aim is anything that moves between below $80 per barrel of oil will be generating a significant positive carbon pricing. At its peak, it almost reaches $100 per ton of CO2. So Mexico is very close to Sweden, Norway, Denmark in terms of its strong carbon pricing signal, but more, it would be closer to the average in the OECD countries, where anything between $40 and $50. And remember, $40 or $50, $51 is the social cost of carbon calculated and used by the Obama administration. And now it's moving towards 100 resources for the future. Scholars estimated now at around $120 per ton of CO2. So Mexico is very close to be on the forefront of carbon pricing in the world, thanks to this mechanism. Remember, this is the story of 2021, and it falls back again in 2022. While the oil markets are being disrupted by the war in Ukraine, that will be the story. But the resiliency is built institutionally, and we have to keep watch to see what happens there. Now, let's take the next 5 minutes, see what was the effect on the environment. And we're saying it's a strong carbon signal. Let's see what would happen. But for that, we need to build a counterfactual. We need to say, what would have been the price scenario if the carbon pricing structure, if the reforms, the tax reforms to the fossil fuel taxation, the structural reforms to the energy market had not happened? What would have happened if the reforms had not consolidated the phase out? And what we have is from 2010, see how flat the real price of gasoline in terms of pesos is very stable. That was the aim of the government. The government from the early 2000s to the early 2010s, its objective was to keep prices at the same level. That was the political necessity, the political equilibrium living there. And it's the phase out starting in 2010 that begins to increase this. And you can see that it was super flat and then it begins to increase. So our two counterfactual scenarios are first the line in brown saying, well, the policy of keeping prices stable would have been the political original equilibrium would have lasted another decade. The idea of this price signal as a key component, as a policy objective, keeping the price of gasoline at the same level was a policy objective. Let's say that that policy objective kept on working during the 2010s. The other plausible counterfactual scenario would be, well, the increase in price towards from 10 pesos for a decade, you live with 10 pesos per liter of gasoline, moving into 15%, 50% increase. Then the idea was, well, we increase, Mexico increases the price, but then stabilizes at that. So it's stability of prices as the policy objective, not the stabilizing at the decade level observed, the previous decade observed level, but at the new level observed. So we have two scenarios. And the line in blue was complete free market per unit tax and let the market have its wild swings, which is, for example, what happens in the US. Any variability, any volatility in the international prices of oil and petroleum products transmits directly to the consumer, or almost directly to the consumer. That's why you move from $1 to $3, $4, $5 per gallon, and then back again to 4, 3, 2. And that is the scenario in blue. So what do we do to estimate the effects? Is basically create the counterfactual scenario quarter by quarter, month by month, of what would have been the consumption had the price been either in the brown trajectory, the 2000s price objective, or the other plausible one, the 2015 objective. We create those scenarios and we estimate what would have been the consumption. And you can see the graph in the middle showing how what happened was the line in green, where consumption as prices increased significantly. Imagine from 10 to 15, and then closer to 20, where we're now, consumption fell. Consumption would have fallen. And remind you, this is a period where incomes are not growing. It's periods where the recession grows. Mexico was growing very, very slowly. So we do not have the income effect, which is very important in middle-income countries. The income elasticity of gasoline and diesel are very high just because you have such a large part of the population about to purchase their first cars. So any price increase moves a significant share of the population towards over that threshold, and gasoline consumption increases. So we have, even with a positive effect of the income elasticity, the price elasticity of gasoline reduces consumption to what we see. Both things are taken into account, and the emission. What do we use to build the counterfactual scenarios? We actually take our work from that looks at the gasoline consumption of the 90s and the early of the 2000s, and even towards the early 2000s and 2010s. And we had estimated a price elasticity of demand of minus 0.82 for gasoline. That work was published, and we used that to build the counterfactual scenarios for this 2022 paper. And for diesel, what we have is minus 0.3, because we relied on the meta-analysis undertaken just about the same period, and it is much less elastic in diesel in this case. And the emission factors are 2.35 kilograms of CO2 per liter of gasoline and 2.69 for diesel. That's the data from EPA. Using these numbers, we estimate the counterfactual scenarios, and you can see here how would they have looked. You still have in gasoline instead of the peak we observed in consumption, that is real observed consumption in 2010, it has its peak and begins to fall as prices begin to increase. You have upward movements when domestic prices are, and the counterfactual scenario would tell you if international prices rise, then the tax is smaller, and the difference that tax makes, that effect of this carbon pricing, is smaller. And the same thing for diesel. The effects are there. What do we estimate in million tons of CO2 to have been saved due to the positive carbon taxation? First, to the fossil fuel subsidy phase out, and then to the positive carbon taxation. We're talking about the subsidy phase out generating around 28 million tons less. The counterfactual would have been, Mexico would have emitted 28 million tons more from gasoline and diesel in terms of CO2 if it had not phased out the subsidies. The counterfactual scenario would have been prices at 10 real pesos per liter. But then when it moves to 15 and to 20 and the taxes begin to increase, then taxes begin to make a difference. The scenario here, it moves from having 30 million tons per year less towards almost 40 million tons of CO2 less per year. And overall, the entire period of fossil fuel subsidy phase out and carbon taxation is generating over this decade almost 272 million tons less. So it is a very important piece of the general strategy. Remember that in Mexico is aiming to have 22%, and now the promise in Egypt seems to be moving towards having a 30 or 35% compared to baseline production. This becomes a significant part of that. And most importantly, what we have here is the GDP intensity of fossil fuels. Remember how we started that Indonesia, Nigeria had an above carbon footprint per $1 million of GDP. Look how Mexico manages to grow economically and reduce the amount of fossil fuels it needs to consolidate that growth. You can see the phase out, we are missing an H there, and during the phase out, we need less than, we're using almost 3 tons of CO2 per million pesos of GDP, then it begins to fall towards 2. And once the carbon tax is introduced and the implicit carbon taxation of the excise tax consolidates, now we're moving below 2 tons of CO2 per million pesos. There I would end my talk and be open to questions. Thank you. By the way, I can remind you that you can make your questions through the Q&A. That's where I can read. And okay. So one of the questions that I normally receive in this case is what would have happened if, what are the price elasticities? The price elasticities that we estimated are from the 2010s, and they're very high by any standard or by the long run price elasticities. Short run price elasticities are smaller. And indeed, what we observe is that if the adjustments a household can make during the period of having, let's say, the price increases and it is a period measured in a few weeks or a few months, there's nothing much you can do. Switch from private transport to public transport, begin to consolidate shippings. So there's changes in practices and logistics. The idea of changing assets of the next purchase of a car takes into account that gasoline has just increased by 50%, begins like in the US and Europe, when the shock prices, the international prices of gasoline and diesel begin to grow so fast, then the car purchases of electric hybrid cars begin to increase, and or generally smaller cars or more fuel efficient cars. And that is a decision that you could situate in the middle as a midterm decision or as a long-term decision. So the more the time passes, and here is the key point, the price in the increase in prices not only is very stable, are steadily increasing, and the public sees that as part of a feature, but the idea that prices will consolidate at a high level, will be increasing slowly but steadily, and then will stabilize at a high level, sends a very important signal. And our argument for using long-term price elasticities is because after a decade, then the long-term effect is in. Households are already taking into account the new prices. Probably the first 2 years, we could use the short-term price elasticity, but then after the 3rd year, 4th year, when the signal is that the policy is there to stay, then it becomes that the estimates should be making a long-term combination. What we've read in the literature is that a mix between the short-term and long-term, you always, in a particular year, have the long-term effect of the past increases, let's say the past 5-year increases in gasoline prices. And probably if there was a change that particular year, for that particular year, that particular increase, you are being affected by the short-term price elasticity, a mix. And it consolidates. Now, the price signal has been very stable. The domestic price signal has been very stable. And we are moving now towards having 4 years at the same level. So we believe that using the long-term price elasticity is there. It's the correct way to go. Okay, let me see. Okay, yes. Then other comment there is the possibility of the counterfactuals. And this is where one needs to ask, what is the plausible, what is the real, how could we inform our counterfactual price scenario? The counterfactual quantity scenario comes from the price elasticities, income, and prices, and hopefully we eventually are thinking in the cross price elasticities. Well, but what about the price scenario? That price is exogenous in this case, or at least the fiscal policy that generates the price. But you have the international shocks. And there's a possibility to improve. We basically built the scenario on what was being observed. The political equilibrium generated a very stable price over time for at least a decade at the same level. And the idea of keeping the price stable is there. We saw the scenario that stabilizes at the 2015 price, then keeps it constant, which one would say, well, why increase and then stay there? It's actually what is happening now from the new administration, 2018, 2019, elected 2018, the 2019, 2020, these past 4 years have been one where the new price, the price at which the administration starts, becomes a political symbol, no more than 20 real pesos per liter. And that has been maintained over time with the variability, with the tax structure, the smoothing tax structure. But that political goal has been there for 4 years. So it was very realistic to think that in 2015, that decision could have been taken, stay at that point and maintain it over time. The idea and the other source, and that would be a comment, something that is not in the paper, but certainly that's part of the feedback we have been receiving, and is that the parallel case studies would work. What was the pricing scenario in Indonesia, in other oil-rich countries, in Nigeria? What was the political decision regarding taxes and domestic prices for gasoline and diesel over time? By looking at similar countries to Mexico and what did they do in the same periods we're looking at, 2010, 2015, 2020, by looking at what they did, then our counterfactual price scenarios become more realistic. That is what would have happened. That's the contribution. And yes, we're receiving a question by Laura Malaguzzi-Valeri. Thank you for that question. That structural changes. First, we indeed are seeing that the automobiles being bought have, on average, more fuel efficiency. Remember that as incomes grow, the idea of having larger cars and faster cars becomes part of that. It's not only demand for cars as a unit, but demands for hedonic cars that would generate more value. And for some consumers, speed is part of the value, or the size of the car becomes important. And despite the effect of income on the type of cars being bought, we're observing a reduction. The average fuel efficiency of cars has been falling over time. And that we need still to separate the effect from the income effect, because this is just being observed. That from the income effect, the price effect, and probably the technological change, the idea of there's more supply of hybrids and a larger, and some electric cars are happening. However, the change in the car stock is very small, because even if the new sales Mexico had from, let's say in Mexico City, from 5 to 10% of the cars being bought are now the most fuel efficient, the highest category, including hybrids. Even if the hybrid sales double, they're still coming from a very small number. And even if they increase their share of the new car sales, the entire stock, the cars on the fleet owned spans at least a decade or probably two. The distribution of ages of cars is there. So what we are seeing, or our argument, our ideas there, is that the purchase of cars are changing, technological, despite income, and thanks to price. But still, people were driving less or were driving more efficiently, because the general effect of lower consumption means this idea of changing practices and probably longer term decisions after a decade. Where do you choose to live or rent an apartment or purchase a house, or the idea of using public transport? If the public transport improves, all those decisions are at play. And the bottom line is that the amount of gasoline per $1 million of GDP and diesel have been falling. And yes, but we can look at that, the amount of cars per 1,000 households. It is one of the variables that we would be looking at. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Now, the questions regarding the climate commitments of Mexico. For those of you that do not know, Mexico's NDC appears to be like an absolute reduction of carbon. It is 22% below, achieve a 22% reduction by 2030, or a 35% reduction by 2030. But it's not a reduction from an absolute year. It's not related to 2010 or 25. It's related to a baseline that was built in the mid-2010s that had very optimistic assumptions regarding growth. This baseline was, what would Mexico's carbon footprint be if the country grew at 3% over the following 15 years? And the idea is no, Mexico has not grown at 3% on average per year. And even with COVID falling, the average growth in non-COVID times was 2%, 1%, on some years with 0. So it is an optimistic baseline regarding growth, and one that assumed that the carbon footprint of Mexico would be growing much faster than it actually grew, not thanks to the policies, but just thanks to, due to the slower growth Mexico experienced and the real shocks experienced by since the 2020s. But even so, that's why our paper ends by saying the real metric that should be used is the carbon footprint per unit of GDP, per $1 million of GDP. And that is what, even though the 22% reduction might easily be achieved because first we didn't grow as much, and then the carbon pricing signal came in. That will be achievable by the end. The 35% probably needs more an emphasis in the energy market liberalization and allowing or not blocking the entry of renewables that the private sector would be investing in. So electricity generation is the key point or the main element that needs to be solved to achieve the reduction of 35%. But the carbon pricing for transport fuels is doing its job and probably will fulfill its goal by 2030 if this current policy stays in, or even better if more price variability is allowed in the future, if the consolidation of the market movements of gasoline and diesel is there. Okay, I think I've answered all the questions, and well, so back to you, Rebecca. Thanks for listening and being here.
I would like to thank Carlos Muñoz Piña for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to visit by visiting IAEE.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.